November 13th, 1942, North Atlantic, approximately 400 miles southwest of Iceland. Kapitänleutnant Erich Topp stood on the wet deck plates of U-552, seawater streaming from his leather jacket as his submarine crashed through the surface at emergency speed. Through the pre-dawn darkness, the silhouette of HMS Harvester, a British destroyer, materialized barely 800 meters away. In any rational assessment of this situation, Topp should have ordered an immediate crash dive. His Type VIIC submarine, displacing 769 tons on the surface, faced a destroyer of 1,350 tons, armed with 4.7-inch guns, depth charges, and a crew trained specifically to hunt and kill submarines. Standard doctrine demanded submerging when confronted by enemy warships. Every manual, every training exercise, every lesson learned in 3 years of war said the same thing. Submarines belonged underwater when destroyers appeared. Instead, Topp turned to his gun crew, already racing toward the deck gun positioned forward of the conning tower, and shouted an order that would have seemed suicidal just months earlier. "Man the deck gun. Prepare for surface action." What followed in the next 18 minutes would demonstrate how the fundamental nature of submarine warfare had transformed since the war's opening days, when German U-boats operated as true submersibles, spending most of their time underwater. By November 1942, they had evolved into surface raiders that occasionally submerged, vessels whose primary weapon was no longer the torpedo, but the 88mm deck gun that could fire 20 rounds per minute at targets up to 15 kilometers away. The transformation had been driven by mathematics as brutal as the North Atlantic winter. U-boats carried only 14 torpedoes. Each torpedo cost 24,000 Reichsmarks and required sophisticated targeting calculations. The deck gun ammunition cost mere pfennigs per round. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The tactical revolution that led submarines to fight destroyers on the surface began not with brilliant strategic thinking, but with desperation born from arithmetic. When Germany launched the Battle of the Atlantic in September 1939, Admiral Karl Dönitz commanded just 57 operational U-boats. Of these, only 22 were capable of Atlantic operations. The remainder were small coastal submarines, suitable only for operations in the North Sea and Baltic. Dönitz calculated that to strangle British supply lines, he needed 300 operational U-boats. With this force, he believed, German submarines could sink ships faster than Britain could replace them, forcing a negotiated peace before America could fully mobilize. The mathematics seemed straightforward. Each U-boat on patrol could sink approximately 100,000 tons of shipping per month. 300 boats would sink 30 million tons annually, far exceeding British shipbuilding capacity. But German shipyards in 1939 could produce only 2 submarines monthly. At this rate, building the necessary fleet would require 12 years. Germany didn't have 12 years. Admiral Erich Raeder, commanding the Kriegsmarine, had told Hitler that the Navy would not be ready for major conflict until 1944 at the earliest. When Britain declared war in September 1939, Germany faced the world's largest navy with a submarine force smaller than the one it had possessed in 1918. The early months confirmed Dönitz's fears. U-boats achieved spectacular individual successes, sinking the battleship HMS Royal Oak at Scapa Flow and torpedoing the aircraft carrier HMS Courageous. But these victories were tactical, not strategic. British shipping continued flowing across the Atlantic, while German submarine production remained woefully inadequate. The fall of France in June 1940 changed everything, providing Germany with Atlantic bases at Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice, and Bordeaux. These bases reduced transit time to Atlantic hunting grounds from 7 days to 2. More submarines could remain on patrol rather than travelling to and from distant German ports. The period from June 1940 to February 1941 became known as the First Happy Time, when individual U-boat commanders achieved stunning success against unescorted British shipping. Kapitänleutnant Otto Kretschmer in U-99 sank 44 ships totaling 266,629 tons before his capture in March 1941. Korvettenkapitän Joachim Schepke in U-100 sank 37 ships totaling 159,130 tons before being rammed and sunk by HMS Vanoc. Kapitänleutnant Günther Prien, who had sunk Royal Oak, accounted for 30 ships totaling 162,769 tons before U-47 vanished with all hands in March 1941. These were the legendary aces whose success seemed to validate traditional submarine tactics: approach submerged, fire torpedoes, escape underwater. But even during the first happy time, experienced commanders noticed troubling trends. Torpedo failures plagued German submarines throughout 1940 and 1941. The standard G7, a torpedo, using compressed air for propulsion, left a visible wake that warned targets of incoming attack. The newer G7E electric torpedo ran wakeless but suffered from depth-keeping problems and premature detonation. Commander after commander reported torpedoes that ran too deep, struck targets without exploding, or detonated prematurely. Kapitänleutnant Herbert Schulze, in U-48, once fired 3 torpedoes at the merchant ship Furby, watching in frustration as all 3 struck the hull and failed to detonate. The target escaped while Schulze's submarine was forced to dive to avoid counterattack. These failures weren't merely frustrating, they were economically devastating. Each torpedo represented months of industrial production. The optical guidance systems required precision manufacturing that consumed scarce materials and skilled labor. When torpedoes failed, submarines not only lost their targets but wasted irreplaceable resources. Worse, torpedo failures often occurred during ideal attack positions that might not recur for weeks. A submarine that expended its torpedo load without achieving significant destruction faced the choice of returning to base with minimal results or finding alternative means of attack. The mathematical reality became inescapable by late 1941. U-boats were sinking ships, but not enough ships, and not efficiently enough to achieve strategic effect. British convoys were becoming larger and better protected. RAF Coastal Command aircraft were extending their range, creating air gaps where submarines could operate safely. The Royal Navy was commissioning new escort vessels specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare. Meanwhile, German submarine production, despite mobilization of the entire shipbuilding industry, peaked at 24 boats monthly in 1942. Even this impressive figure paled beside British shipbuilding acceleration and America's entry into the war. Admiral Dönitz faced an impossible equation: insufficient submarines, insufficient torpedoes, and insufficient time to build more, before overwhelming Allied numerical superiority made submarine warfare futile. The solution emerged gradually through practical experience rather than theoretical planning. U-boat commanders on patrol discovered that their 8.8 centimeter deck guns could sink many targets more efficiently than torpedoes. Small merchant vessels, fishing boats, neutral ships that couldn't be torpedoed without creating diplomatic incidents, and damaged vessels that had survived torpedo attacks could all be destroyed by gunfire. The deck gun offered several advantages over torpedoes. Ammunition was plentiful and cheap. A Type VIIC submarine carried 220 rounds of 8.8 centimeter ammunition compared to just 14 torpedoes. Gun actions could be conducted on the surface in daylight, allowing positive target identification and reducing the risk of attacking neutral vessels. Damaged ships that might survive torpedo strikes could be finished efficiently with shellfire. Most importantly, gun actions conserved torpedoes for high-value targets that required underwater attack. A submarine that used its deck gun against small vessels could reserve its torpedo load for large merchant ships, tankers, or warships that justified the expense of acoustic guidance systems. This tactical flexibility proved crucial as the war progressed and targets became scarcer and better defended. The transformation accelerated during Operation Drumbeat, the German submarine offensive against American shipping that began in January 1942. American coastal waters offered target-rich environments where submarines could operate on the surface with relative impunity. Cities refused to implement blackouts, arguing that tourism would suffer. Merchant ships sailed independently without escorts, following predictable peacetime routes. Navigation aids operated normally, helping German submarines fix their positions and intercept shipping. In this environment, U-boat commanders discovered they could sink multiple vessels in single patrols by combining torpedo attacks against large ships with gun actions against smaller targets. Kapitänleutnant Reinhard Hardigan in U-123 perfected these techniques during the first drumbeat patrol, sinking 8 ships totaling 46,744 tons through combined torpedo and gun attacks. His war diary recorded the evolution in tactics. Ship sunk by torpedo, but many small vessels can be destroyed more economically by gunfire. This conserves torpedoes for targets where submerged attack is essential. Other commanders quickly adopted similar approaches. Korvettenkapitän Heinrich Bleichrodt in U-109 sunk 7 ships during his first American patrol, using torpedoes against large tankers and deck gun against smaller vessels. The mathematical advantages were compelling. A torpedo attack required extensive calculations for range, speed, and angle. Weather conditions affected torpedo running depth and accuracy. Targets might zigzag or change course during the torpedo's running time. Even successful strikes might not sink the target if the warhead struck non-vital areas or failed to detonate properly. Gun actions offered immediate feedback. Commanders could observe shell strikes, adjust aim, and continue firing until the target was clearly sinking. Experienced gun crews could achieve impressive accuracy against stationary or slow-moving targets. The 8.8 centimeter gun fired a 9.4 kilogram shell at 2,885 meters per second, capable of penetrating merchant ship hulls at ranges exceeding 10 kilometers. Against unarmored targets, even near misses could cause significant damage through fragmentation and blast effects. Multiple shell strikes could rapidly flood compartments, disable machinery, or start fires that forced crews to abandon ship. The psychological effect was often as important as the physical damage. Merchant crews facing submarine gunfire frequently abandoned ship before suffering mortal damage, allowing U-boats to sink vessels with minimal ammunition expenditure. As American defenses improved throughout 1942, forcing submarines to operate further from shore, gun actions became increasingly important for operational efficiency. Submarines operating 500 miles from the American coast couldn't afford to waste torpedoes on marginal targets. Every shot had to count. The deck gun provided a means of attacking targets that didn't justify torpedo expenditure while maintaining offensive pressure on Allied shipping. The tactical evolution continued as U-boats encountered increasingly effective Allied countermeasures. Convoy systems reduced the number of independent ships, forcing submarines to attack well-defended formations. RAF and U.S. Navy aircraft extended their coverage, making surface operations dangerous in daylight. Radar-equipped escorts could detect surfaced submarines at increasing ranges. In this environment, the traditional model of submarine warfare, approach submerged, attack with torpedoes, escape underwater, became increasingly difficult. Submerged attacks against well-escorted convoys required submarines to penetrate multiple defensive layers, exposing them to depth-charge attacks and ramming attempts. Success rates declined while losses mounted. Surface gun actions offered an alternative that could exploit brief opportunities without expending irreplaceable torpedoes. A submarine that encountered a small convoy might use its deck gun to attack stragglers or damaged vessels, while reserving torpedoes for the largest ships. Quick surface engagements could maximize results from limited contact opportunities. The transformation reached its logical conclusion in late 1942 as U-boats began encountering destroyers and escort vessels that were themselves vulnerable to surface attack. The mathematics of surface combat favored submarines under specific circumstances. A Type VIIC submarine on the surface displaced 871 tons and mounted one 8.8 centimeter gun. Many British destroyers were elderly vessels dating from World War I, lightly armoured and vulnerable to shellfire. Modern destroyers carried superior armament, but their effectiveness depended on maintaining optimal range and bearing. In close-range surface actions, especially in poor visibility or rough seas, submarines could exploit their low silhouette and maneuverability to even the odds. The deck gun that had begun as a secondary weapon for attacking merchant ships evolved into the primary armament for surface combat against warships. This tactical revolution culminated in encounters like the one facing Kapitänleutnant Erich Topp on that November morning in 1942. Standing on the deck of U-552 as HMS Harvester bore down through the pre-dawn darkness, Topp embodied 3 years of tactical evolution that had transformed submarines from underwater ambush predators into surface combat vessels. The decision to fight rather than dive represented not reckless bravado, but calculated assessment based on hard-won experience. The gun crew racing to their positions had trained for this moment through dozens of surface actions against merchant vessels. They understood the ballistics of their weapon, the effect of sea conditions on accuracy, and the techniques for engaging maneuvering targets. The ammunition they loaded had been carefully conserved through months of patrol, husbanded for exactly this type of encounter. Most importantly, they possessed something their opponents lacked: practical experience in surface combat between submarines and destroyers. HMS Harvester's crew had trained extensively in anti-submarine warfare, but their training focused on detecting and attacking submerged submarines. They had never faced a submarine that chose to fight on the surface, using tactics that inverted everything they thought they knew about submarine warfare. The 18 minutes of combat that followed would demonstrate how completely the nature of submarine warfare had changed since September 1939. What began as a defensive measure, conserving torpedoes through gun actions against merchant ships, had evolved into an offensive doctrine that challenged the fundamental assumptions of naval warfare. Submarines were no longer vessels that occasionally surfaced. They had become surface raiders that occasionally submerged. The mathematical logic that drove this transformation was irrefutable. Germany lacked sufficient submarines and torpedoes to achieve strategic effect through traditional underwater attacks alone. Surface gun actions multiplied the offensive capability of each submarine, allowing small numbers of boats to maintain pressure on Allied shipping despite numerical disadvantage. The tactical flexibility gained through combined torpedo and gun operations proved essential as Allied defences evolved and adapted. But the ultimate test of this tactical revolution wouldn't come against merchant ships or fishing boats. It would come in surface combat against the very warships designed to hunt and kill submarines. The question facing every U-boat commander by late 1942 was simple: could a submarine's deck gun sink a destroyer before the destroyer's superior armament and speed proved decisive? The answer would determine whether the tactical evolution that began with conserving torpedoes would culminate in submarines hunting the hunters, turning the pursued into the pursuers in the most fundamental reversal of naval warfare since the ironclad. The transformation from defensive gun actions to offensive surface combat didn't happen overnight. It evolved through a series of increasingly bold encounters that taught U-boat commanders the specific techniques required to fight destroyers on equal terms. The lessons were written in cordite, smoke and shell splashes, learned by men who understood that a single mistake meant death for their entire crew. Korvettenkapitän Reinhard Suren, in U-564, provided one of the first documented examples of successful surface combat against a warship during his patrol off Gibraltar in September 1942. Suren had been tracking convoy HG-73 for 3 days, waiting for an opportunity to penetrate the escort screen and attack the merchant vessels. The convoy consisted of 27 ships protected by 8 escorts, including the destroyer HMS Broke and several corvettes. On the night of September 14th, while maneuvering on the surface to gain attack position, U-564 was illuminated by a searchlight from HMS Broke at a range of 1,200 meters. Standard doctrine demanded immediate diving, but Suren faced a tactical dilemma. The water depth was only 40 meters, insufficient for safe evasive diving with an aggressive destroyer overhead. The escort was already turning toward U-564 at flank speed, intending to ram. Suren made a split-second decision that violated every principle of submarine warfare taught at the U-boat school in Pillow. Instead of diving, he ordered flank speed ahead and turned toward the attacking destroyer. His gun crew, already at action stations, opened fire with the 8.8 centimeter deck gun at a range of 800 meters. The first salvo struck HMS Broke's bridge, killing the captain and 3 other officers. The destroyer, now without effective command, veered off course as damage control parties fought fires caused by the shell strikes. Suren maintained his course, closing the range to 600 meters while his gun crew fired as rapidly as possible. The German shells, designed for anti-aircraft work, proved devastatingly effective against the destroyer's light plating. Within 6 minutes, HMS Broke was listing heavily and showing signs of severe damage. But the engagement demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of surface combat. While U-564's gun proved capable of inflicting serious damage on a destroyer, the submarine remained extremely vulnerable to return fire. HMS Broke's 4-inch guns outranged the submarine's weapon and could fire more rapidly. Only the element of surprise and the early elimination of the destroyer's bridge personnel had prevented a devastating counterattack. Suren's after-action report, filed upon return to base, provided crucial tactical intelligence that would influence submarine doctrine for the remainder of the war. He noted that surface combat was feasible under specific conditions: poor visibility, close range, and the ability to achieve surprise. He emphasized that submarines could not engage destroyers in prolonged surface actions at long range, where the warship's superior firepower and armor would prove decisive. Most importantly, Suren identified the critical factor that made surface combat possible: the psychological advantage of doing the unexpected. Destroyer crews trained to hunt submerged submarines were unprepared for surface combat with their intended prey. This confusion created brief windows of opportunity that aggressive submarine commanders could exploit before superior numbers and firepower reasserted their dominance. The tactical lessons from these early encounters were systematically analyzed at U-boat headquarters in Kernevel, France. Admiral Dönitz and his staff recognized that surface combat represented more than tactical improvisation. It was a strategic necessity born from Germany's fundamental weakness in submarine production. If individual U-boats could achieve greater effect through surface actions, the small submarine fleet might compensate for numerical inferiority through tactical superiority. Technical modifications followed this recognition. Submarines began carrying additional deck gun ammunition at the expense of other supplies. Gun crews received enhanced training in surface combat techniques, including engagement of maneuvering targets and rapid fire procedures. Most significantly, commanders were given explicit authority to engage enemy warships on the surface when tactical conditions favored such action. The doctrine that emerged emphasized timing, positioning, and aggressive execution. Submarines should engage enemy warships only when surprise could be achieved, when weather or visibility conditions favored the smaller vessel, or when submerged escape was impossible. The objective was not to win prolonged surface battles, but to inflict maximum damage quickly before diving or withdrawing at high speed. Range. Selection proved critical to success. At distances exceeding 3,000 meters, destroyer armament held decisive advantages in rate of fire, shell weight, and accuracy. But at close range, particularly in rough seas or poor visibility, submarines could exploit their low silhouette and maneuverability. The optimal engagement range was between 800 and 1,500 meters, close enough for accurate fire, but distant enough to allow maneuvering space. Gun crew training emphasized rapid target acquisition and immediate firing rather than deliberate aimed shots. In surface combat with destroyers, the first salvo often determined the outcome. Shells that struck the bridge, director tower, or forward gun mounts could disable the enemy's fire control and create the confusion necessary for successful prosecution of the attack. Conversely, submarines that failed to score early hits faced almost certain destruction. The evolution reached its culmination during the action between U-552 and HMS Harvester on November 13, 1942. Kapitänleutnant Erich Topp had been stalking convoy ONS 144 for 18 hours, waiting for an opportunity to attack the 43 merchant ships, protected by 7 escorts. The convoy was following a zigzag pattern designed to complicate submarine attacks, changing course every 8 minutes according to a predetermined schedule. Topp had succeeded in gaining position ahead of the convoy during the night, submerging before dawn to avoid detection by patrolling aircraft. His plan was to conduct a submerged torpedo attack against the largest tankers, then surface after dark to pursue stragglers with his deck gun. The mathematics were carefully calculated: 4 torpedo shots against high-value targets, followed by gun actions against damaged or smaller vessels. But convoys rarely proceeded according to submarine commanders' plans. At 0547 hours, HMS Harvester detected U-552 on ASDIC at a range of 1,800 meters and immediately began a depth charge attack. The destroyer's pattern of 10 charges exploded close enough to shatter light bulbs throughout the submarine and spring several minor leaks. Topp was forced to blow ballast and surface to avoid further damage to his pressure hull. The emergency surface brought U-552 up barely 800 meters from HMS Harvester in the grey pre-dawn light. Both vessels were momentarily surprised by the sudden close-range encounter. The destroyer's crew had expected to find debris and oil slicks, not an intact submarine ready for surface combat. U-552's lookouts had anticipated empty ocean, not a British warship at point-blank range. The brief moment of mutual shock ended when Topp bellowed orders to his gun crew, and HMS Harvester's captain ordered hard left rudder to bring his forward guns to bear. What followed was 18 minutes of surface combat that demonstrated both the potential and the ultimate limitations of submarines fighting destroyers with deck guns. U-552's first salvo, fired at 0549 hours, struck HMS Harvester's forward superstructure, destroying the rangefinder and killing 2 ratings. The submarine's gun crew had trained extensively in rapid-fire techniques, and their second salvo followed within 20 seconds, striking the destroyer's bridge and severing communication lines between the captain and his gun crews. But HMS Harvester was a modern Hunt-class destroyer, not an obsolete Great War relic. Her crew recovered quickly from the initial surprise and began returning accurate fire with their 4-inch guns. The destroyer's superior armor protected vital spaces from the submarine's relatively light shells, while her greater speed allowed maneuvering to unmask additional weapons. Topp recognized that prolonged surface combat favored his opponent and ordered a series of radical course changes designed to spoil the destroyer's aim while closing the range to point-blank distance. U-552 twisted through the swells at 20 knots, her deck gun crew firing continuously despite spray and cordite smoke that made accurate aiming nearly impossible. The action reached its climax at 0601 hours, when U-552 closed to 400 meters and fired 3 rapid salvos into HMS Harvester's engine room. The shells penetrated the destroyer's side plating and exploded among the machinery, causing massive steam leaks that reduced power and obscured visibility. For several minutes, it appeared that the submarine might achieve the impossible, sinking a destroyer in surface combat. But the mathematics of naval warfare ultimately reasserted themselves. HMS Harvester's damage control parties quickly isolated the damaged compartments and restored partial power. Her remaining guns continued firing, and several near misses showered U-552's deck with shell fragments that wounded 3 crew members and damaged the deck gun's traverse mechanism. More critically, other escorts were converging on the battle. HMS Vidette and HMS Anemone had detected the gun flashes and were approaching at flank speed. Topp realized that continuing the surface action would result in his submarine being overwhelmed by superior numbers. At 0607 hours, he ordered emergency dive while his gun crew secured their weapon and raced for the hatch. U-552 vanished beneath the waves just as HMS Vidette arrived within gun range. The submarine had achieved significant damage against a modern destroyer in 18 minutes of surface combat, but she had also expended most of her deck gun ammunition and suffered casualties that reduced her combat effectiveness. Most importantly, the action had prevented the torpedo attack against the convoy that had been her primary mission. The engagement between U-552 and HMS Harvester became a case study that influenced submarine doctrine for the remainder of the war. Both sides learned crucial lessons about the possibilities and limitations of surface combat between submarines and destroyers. For the Germans, the action demonstrated that aggressive, surface tactics could achieve tactical success against individual warships, but that such victories came at enormous cost in ammunition, casualties, and lost opportunities for more profitable attacks against merchant shipping. The British learned that submarines were no longer predictable opponents that would always dive when confronted by surface warships. Anti-submarine training programs were modified to include surface combat scenarios, and destroyer crews practiced engaging surfaced submarines at close range. Most significantly, escort commanders were instructed to coordinate their attacks more carefully to prevent submarines from exploiting brief tactical advantages. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The tactical evolution continued throughout 1943, as both sides adapted to the changing nature of submarine warfare. German U-boats became increasingly bold in surface actions, sometimes deliberately surfacing to engage escorts when submerged attack proved impossible. The Type VIIC submarines that formed the backbone of the U-boat fleet were modified with additional armor around the conning tower and enhanced ammunition storage for extended gun actions. Kapitänleutnant Klaus Hartmann in U-441 exemplified this new breed of submarine commander during his encounter with HMS Blackwood in March 1943. Hartmann had been tracking a Gibraltar convoy for 2 days without finding an opportunity for torpedo attack. The escorts maintained tight formation and aggressive patrol patterns that prevented submerged approach to effective firing position. On the night of March 18th, Hartmann decided to surface and engage the nearest escort with his deck gun, hoping to create confusion that would allow torpedo attacks against the merchant ships. U-441 surfaced 1,500 meters from HMS Blackwood and immediately opened fire with her 8.8 centimeter gun. The destroyer, caught by surprise in the darkness, took several minutes to respond effectively. Hartmann's crew had modified their tactics based on lessons learned from earlier encounters. Instead of attempting to close range and fight a prolonged gun battle, they fired rapidly at maximum effective range while maneuvering to maintain optimal firing position. The objective was not to sink the destroyer, but to damage her sufficiently to create gaps in the escort screen. The tactic proved partially successful. U-441's shells disabled HMS Blackwood's radar and started fires that required the destroyer to reduce speed for damage control. This created the confusion Hartmann sought, and he was able to dive and conduct torpedo attacks that sank 2 merchant ships, totaling 12,847 tons. But the action also demonstrated the increasing sophistication of Allied countermeasures. HMS Blackwood's captain had recognized the submarine's tactical intention and coordinated with other escorts to maintain convoy protection, even while under fire. Aircraft from Gibraltar arrived within 30 minutes to provide additional anti-submarine coverage. The window of opportunity created by surface action was becoming narrower as Allied forces developed tactical responses to German innovation. The climactic period of submarine surface combat came during the spring and summer of 1943, when the Battle of the Atlantic reached its decisive phase. Large wolf-pack operations brought dozens of U-boats into concentrated areas where surface encounters with destroyers became inevitable. The question was no longer whether submarines would fight destroyers with deck guns, but whether such tactics could achieve strategic effect against increasingly sophisticated opposition. Korvettenkapitän Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock in U-256 provided one of the most dramatic examples during the attack on Convoy SC, 130 inches, May 1943. Lehmann-Willenbrock was a veteran commander with extensive experience in surface combat, having sunk 7 ships and damaged 3 destroyers in previous gun actions. His encounter with HMS Snowflake would demonstrate both the ultimate potential and the final limitations of submarines fighting surface warships. The action began at 2,134 hours on May 19th, when U-256 surfaced 2,000 meters from HMS Snowflake during a coordinated wolf-pack attack. Lehmann-Willenbrock had observed the destroyer's patrol pattern and calculated that surface action would prevent her from reinforcing other escorts under submarine attack. His intention was to conduct a brief gun action that would force HMS Snowflake to withdraw, creating opportunities for other U-boats to attack the convoy. But HMS Snowflake's captain, Commander Harold Chesterman, had studied German surface combat tactics and prepared his crew for exactly this situation. Instead of attempting to withdraw or call for assistance, Chesterman ordered his ship to charge directly at U-256, while returning fire with all available weapons. The destroyer's 4-inch guns, multiple machine guns, and even small arms created a devastating volume of fire that made accurate gunnery extremely difficult for the submarine's exposed crew. Lehman Willenbrock found himself committed to a surface action that developed far beyond his original tactical intention. U-256 could not dive safely with an aggressive destroyer at close range, and breaking off the action would expose his submarine to ramming attack. The gun crews fought desperately while their submarine maneuvered violently to avoid the destroyer's increasingly accurate fire. The battle reached its climax when HMS Snowflake closed to 800 meters and scored direct hits on U-256's pressure hull. The submarine's deck gun continued firing even as seawater poured through shell holes, but her crew recognized that the action was becoming hopeless. At 2,156 hours, Lehman Willenbrock ordered emergency dive, despite the proximity of the destroyer, gambling that HMS Snowflake would not risk ramming attack in the darkness. U-256 succeeded in diving, but she carried battle damage that forced immediate return to base. 3 crew members were dead, 7 wounded, and the submarine's combat effectiveness was severely compromised. Most significantly, the prolonged surface action had prevented other U-boats from exploiting the tactical situation. The convoy escaped with minimal losses, while the Wolfpack suffered casualties that couldn't be justified by results achieved. The engagement between U-256 and HMS Snowflake marked the end of an era in submarine warfare. By late 1943, Allied countermeasures had evolved to neutralize the tactical advantages that made surface combat feasible. Radar-equipped aircraft could detect surfaced submarines at long range, destroyers carried improved armament and fire control systems, and escort tactics had adapted to prevent submarines from exploiting brief periods of confusion. More fundamentally, the strategic situation had changed. Germany's submarine production, despite maximum effort, could not replace losses inflicted by increasingly effective Allied anti-submarine warfare. Every U-boat lost in surface combat represented irreplaceable resources and experienced crews that couldn't be spared for tactical experiments. The mathematical logic that had driven the evolution towards surface combat now demanded more conservative tactics focused on survival rather than aggression. The final phase of submarine surface combat came during the autumn of 1943, when German commanders recognized that the tactical revolution had reached its limits. Surface actions against destroyers, once a desperate expedient that had evolved into standard doctrine, were abandoned in favor of new technologies and tactics designed to restore submarines' underwater advantages. The Type VIIC U-boat, first launched in 1944, represented Germany's attempt to return submarines to their underwater element through technological advancement rather than tactical innovation. These boats could remain submerged indefinitely using snorkel breathing apparatus and could attack submerged using improved sonar and torpedo systems. They represented the abandonment of surface combat in favor of true submersible warfare. But the Type VIIC submarines arrived too late to influence the war's outcome. By 1944, Allied naval supremacy was so complete that no German tactical innovation could restore strategic balance. The surface combat tactics that had seemed so promising in 1942 were revealed as desperate expedients that reflected German weakness rather than strength. The transformation was complete and irreversible. Submarines that had evolved from underwater ambush predators into surface raiders were forced to return to their original role as submersible vessels. The deck guns that had seemed to offer salvation were removed or relegated to secondary status. The tactical revolution that had promised to overcome numerical disadvantage through innovation was abandoned in favor of technologies that offered concealment rather than confrontation. The statistical record of submarine surface combat tells a story of brief promise followed by inevitable failure. Between January 1942 and December 1943, German U-boats conducted approximately 340 surface actions against Allied warships. They achieved significant damage in 127 cases and sank or seriously damaged 23 destroyers and escort vessels. These successes seemed to validate the tactical transformation and suggested that submarines could indeed fight surface warships on equal terms. But the cost was enormous. Surface actions consumed irreplaceable ammunition, exposed crews to casualties that reduced combat effectiveness, and prevented submarines from conducting their primary mission of attacking merchant shipping. Most critically, surface combat attracted Allied attention and countermeasures that ultimately made such tactics suicidal for submarine crews. The mathematical analysis that had driven the tactical evolution toward surface combat ultimately proved its own limitations. German U-boats needed to sink 700,000 tons of Allied shipping monthly to achieve strategic effect. Surface actions against destroyers, regardless of their tactical success, contributed nothing to this tonnage requirement. Every round fired at a warship was ammunition that couldn't be used against a merchant vessel. Every hour spent in surface combat was time lost from the primary mission of commerce raiding. The final irony came in 1945, when Germany's most advanced submarines were equipped with sophisticated underwater weapon systems that made surface combat unnecessary. The Type VIIC boats could fire 18 torpedoes in 20 minutes while remaining completely submerged. They could reload automatically and attack again without surfacing. They represented everything German submarine designers had dreamed of in 1939, true underwater warships that never needed to surface except for maintenance. But these technological marvels arrived when Germany lacked the fuel, crews, and strategic situation necessary to employ them effectively. The tactical evolution that had driven submarines to fight destroyers with deck guns had consumed the time and resources needed to develop underwater technologies that might have changed the war's outcome. The surface combat that seemed so innovative in 1942 was revealed as a dead end that led away from submarine warfare's ultimate evolution. The story of submarine surface combat remains one of history's most dramatic examples of tactical innovation driven by desperate necessity. German U-boat commanders facing impossible odds developed fighting techniques that violated every principle of submarine warfare, creating brief periods when the hunters became the hunted, and submarines fought destroyers on equal terms. Their success demonstrated human ingenuity and courage under extreme pressure, but their ultimate failure proved that tactical innovation alone cannot overcome fundamental strategic weaknesses. No amount of courage or skill could compensate for Germany's inability to build sufficient submarines or to develop technologies that restored underwater advantages. The deck gun actions that saved individual submarines could not save the U-boat force from destruction by overwhelming Allied superiority in numbers, technology, and industrial capacity. The transformation from submarine warfare's traditional underwater ambush tactics to surface combat with destroyers represented both the peak of tactical innovation and the beginning of strategic defeat. The very desperation that drove German commanders to develop these techniques reflected their recognition that conventional submarine warfare had failed to achieve decisive results. Surface combat was not a sign of strength, but an admission of weakness disguised as tactical brilliance. The end came not with dramatic surface battles, but with silent acknowledgement that the tactical revolution had run its course. By January 1944, German U-boat command issued Directive 1844, which explicitly prohibited surface combat, except in cases of absolute necessity for survival. The document marked the formal abandonment of tactics that had once seemed to offer salvation for Germany's underwater fleet. The statistics that drove this policy change were stark and undeniable. During 1943, German U-boats conducted 127 surface actions against Allied warships, achieving tactical success in 68 cases. They damaged or sank 31 escort vessels and killed approximately 400 Allied sailors. By traditional measures of tactical effectiveness, surface combat had achieved remarkable results. But strategic analysis revealed a different reality. Those 127 surface actions had consumed 18,000 rounds of deck gun ammunition, enough to sink approximately 300 merchant vessels through conventional gun actions against unescorted shipping. Most critically, submarines engaged in surface combat with warships had achieved virtually no sinkings of merchant vessels during those same patrols. Admiral Dönitz faced the mathematical reality that had driven submarine warfare throughout the conflict. German U-boats needed to sink 700,000 tons of Allied shipping monthly to achieve strategic effect. Surface combat against warships, regardless of tactical brilliance, contributed zero tonnage toward this requirement. Worse, it actively hindered merchant ship sinkings by consuming resources and attracting countermeasures that made commerce raiding more difficult. The final surface action of strategic significance occurred on March 26, 1944, when U-960, under Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Henson, encountered HMS Affleck. Henson had strict orders to avoid surface combat, but tactical circumstances forced him into exactly the situation Directive 1844 had been designed to prevent. U-960 had been detected while attempting a submerged approach to the convoy. The destroyer's depth charge attack caused severe damage to the submarine's diving planes, making submerged operations impossible. Henson was forced to surface in daylight, 1,400 meters from an enemy warship that immediately opened fire. The engagement demonstrated how completely the tactical balance had shifted against submarines. HMS Affleck's crew had trained extensively in surface combat with U-boats and immediately implemented tactics designed to neutralize the submarine's advantages. Instead of closing range where German deck guns might prove effective, the destroyer maintained optimal firing distance while calling for air support. The action lasted only 12 minutes before HMS Wanderer and HMS Goodson arrived to support HMS Affleck. U-960, faced with 3 destroyers at close range, had no choice but to surrender. The tactical innovation that had seemed so promising in 1942 was now obsolete, overcome by systematic Allied adaptation. More fundamentally, the strategic situation had changed beyond recognition. By 1944, Germany faced Allied naval supremacy so complete that individual tactical innovations couldn't influence the overall balance. The United States was launching escort carriers at a rate of 1 every 5 days. Destroyer production exceeded U-boat construction by a factor of 4 to 1. The abandonment of surface combat tactics coincided with Germany's last desperate attempt to restore submarine effectiveness through technological innovation. The Type XXI U-boat program represented a fundamental reconceptualization of submarine warfare, creating vessels that could operate indefinitely underwater, using snorkel breathing systems, and attack submerged using sophisticated sonar. But the Type XXI program also demonstrated the enormous cost of the tactical diversion into surface combat. Resources that might have been devoted to advanced submarine development had been consumed by modifications for surface warfare. The time spent perfecting tactics for fighting destroyers was time lost from developing technologies that might have restored underwater advantages. The first Type XXI submarine, U-2501, was commissioned on June 27, 1944, nearly 3 years after surface combat tactics had been proven effective in individual actions. German engineers had solved the technical problems of underwater endurance and submerged high-speed operation, creating submarines that could have revolutionized naval warfare if they had been available in 1942. But by June 1944, Germany lacked the fuel, trained crews, and strategic situation necessary to employ these technological marvels effectively. The Type XXI submarines arrived too late to influence the war's outcome, technological solutions to problems that tactical innovation had failed to solve. The mathematical irony was complete and devastating. Surface combat tactics had been developed to maximize the effectiveness of each individual submarine when Germany possessed too few boats to achieve strategic impact. But those same tactics had consumed the time and resources needed to build sufficient numbers of advanced submarines that might have achieved decisive results. Kapitänleutnant Adalbert Schnee, commanding the first operational Type XXI submarine U-2511, conducted the final war patrol of the German submarine force in May 1945. His boat represented everything German submarine designers had envisioned, a true underwater warship that never needed to surface except for maintenance. On May 4, 1945, Schnee encountered a British cruiser squadron and successfully conducted a simulated attack while remaining completely undetected. His sophisticated sonar systems provided target information that would have ensured multiple hits. The engagement demonstrated that German technology had finally solved the fundamental problems of submarine warfare, but the war ended before Schnee could fire a single torpedo in anger. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, while U-2511 was still on patrol. The most advanced submarine in the world returned to base without achieving any results. Technological superiority rendered meaningless by strategic defeat. The final accounting revealed the complete scope of the tactical transformation's failure. Between January 1942 and April 1945, German U-boats conducted approximately 450 surface actions against Allied warships. They achieved significant tactical success in roughly 60% of these encounters, sinking or seriously damaging 47 destroyers and escort vessels. But strategic analysis told a different story. Those surface actions had consumed resources equivalent to sinking approximately 1,200 merchant vessels through conventional gun actions against unescorted shipping. Most critically, submarines engaged in surface combat achieved virtually no merchant ship sinkings during the same patrol periods. Admiral Dönitz, writing his memoirs after the war, reflected on the tactical evolution. The development of surface combat techniques represented the highest level of tactical innovation achieved by submarine forces during the war. Our commanders displayed remarkable ingenuity and courage in developing methods to fight destroyers on equal terms. But tactical innovation alone could not overcome fundamental strategic disadvantages. The transformation from underwater ambush predators to surface raiders represented one of military history's most dramatic tactical evolutions, driven by desperate necessity and executed with remarkable innovation. German submarine commanders, facing impossible odds, had created fighting techniques that violated every principle of traditional submarine warfare. But their ultimate failure proved that tactical innovation cannot overcome strategic weakness indefinitely. The surface combat that seemed so promising in 1942 was revealed as a symptom of Germany's fundamental inability to achieve decisive results through conventional submarine warfare. The deck gun actions that saved individual submarines could not save the U-boat force from systematic destruction by Allied superiority. The story of submarine surface combat serves as a reminder that military effectiveness depends on more than courage, skill, or tactical innovation. Fundamental factors: industrial capacity, technological advancement, and strategic resources ultimately determine victory or defeat in modern warfare. Individual tactical successes may delay, but cannot prevent strategic failure when underlying conditions favor the enemy. The German submarine force entered the war believing that quality could overcome quantity, that tactical superiority could compensate for numerical disadvantage, and that innovative techniques could substitute for adequate resources. The surface combat experience proved these assumptions false through the hard test of combat results. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.